You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Gable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language.
It's a classic, of course, people from a lot of languages leaving out articles in English. Why do we say the sidewalk? You can go to church and go to the church, and they have different meanings, in fact. The article system is substantially complicated.
Oh.
And you know what you find happens with some of these issues that are difficult in English, faced with the fact that there's so many non-native speakers of English, is that they are developing their own version of English that kind of runs around some of these difficulties.
Today we talk about a familiar language, English, and its place in the world. Dick Feldman, director of the Language Resource Center, discusses how non-native English speakers deal with some of the complexities of the language. Dick, I wonder, is English the most spoken language in the world?
Well, in fact, it's not. And thinking about the role of our own language in the world is certainly an important part of thinking about foreign language learning. Some students say sometimes, why should we learn a foreign language when, well, everybody speaks English anyway? So learning more about English and how to navigate with it in the world is an important part of being an intercultural being these days. So, no, English is actually the third largest language by number of native speakers after Mandarin and Spanish.
I see. It seems like there's a variety of English types. I mean, not just dialects, but actual completely different approaches to the language.
There are all sorts of speakers of English, that's for sure, both among the native-speaking population of English and among the non-native-speaking English population. Those are usually divided according to a guy named Kotru from the University of Illinois, who devised this system into the inner circle of English, the outer circle of English, and what he calls the expanding circle of English. So the inner circle are traditional countries that have always had English as their vastly majority language. So that's the United States, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand. And then the second outer circle are those countries that have adopted English largely from a colonial history as their official language. So this is, or one of their official languages. So this is India as maybe the major, largest one. You know, if you ask Indians, what's your native language, many of them will say English.
Really? Huh.
Yes, and they may or may not speak one, two, or three other languages. But they can't. Many Indians can't remember a time when they didn't speak English. And English has moved into a lot of those languages with what we call, you might call it code switching, but you might just call it borrowing, making a lot of inroads into the other languages of South Asia there. But anyway, there are an enormous number of second language speakers of English, people who don't speak English as their mother tongue, as the first language that they learned, but have learned it later. In fact, there are 3 times as many second language speakers of English than there are first language speakers of English.
Huh.
So, you know, who owns English now? Is it our language? Or if you talk about the number of people who use it, it maybe belongs to this group of second language speakers, and they're the ones who are forming it and are moving it in new directions, regardless of where we are, thinking that we're sitting here, well, it's our language. Well, it's our language in that we use it, but in the world, it doesn't necessarily belong to us.
Well, I've noticed from the technology perspective, just looking at documentation for technical systems or even just programming, English is quite pervasive. And from my perspective, it almost seems like you can pretty much always find somebody to speak English. I mean, is that true? Is this is there a need to learn another language if everybody speaks English?
Well, there's an old saying, if you're buying, you can speak your language. If you're selling, you better speak the language of the people around you.
Right.
And maybe when you go to the sales meeting, everybody will be there speaking English as their second or third language.
Right.
As you go off to dinner, they're not speaking English.
Right.
And where are you going to be if you're just a monolingual English speaker?
Sure.
They say somebody who speaks 3 languages is trilingual. Somebody who speaks 2 languages is bilingual. Somebody who speaks 1 language is an American.
That sounds right. But it's funny, though. I mean, it seems that English is very difficult, from what I understand. It's very hard to learn. It's sort of odd, or maybe that's one of the reasons why many Americans only speak 1 language. But is it true that English is hard to understand and speak for a new learner? I mean, you've done English as a second language, certainly, for years.
Yes. Well, it's kind of hard to say universally that 1 language is harder than another. When you start with 1 language as your native language and you address another language, you can kind of assess whether that is a difficult language or an easy language. So for an English speaker, it's easier to learn Dutch or German or French than it is to learn Chinese or Japanese, because there are, for multiple reasons, there are greater differences, and we share a lot of history with some languages, of course. There are some things that make English difficult, and if you're going to be a second language speaker using English in the world, it behooves you to be aware of these aspects of English that are difficult for non-native speakers.
Right.
May be difficult for them to speak, and it may make it difficult for them to understand you, figuring that, well, you were born on third base. You grew up learning English.
Right.
So there's one example of why English is difficult, or any language really, is that we use culture-specific metaphors in it that other people may not be familiar with.
Right.
As you know, baseball isn't played everywhere in the world.
Sure.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Right. Interesting. Well, so as a teacher, you not only have you taught English, of course, you speak other languages, and certainly in our work here, we're dealing with, all sorts of language, pedagogy for all different types of languages. So I wonder, are there similar issues? Is it the same approach that would you take the same approach to teaching English that you think a German teacher or some Southeast Asian language teacher might take, or is it in its own category, is what I'm wondering. Are there issues that only English really has to deal with from a pedagogical perspective?
Well, the general principles of language teaching mostly apply to any pair of languages, learning and knowing, though to some extent if the 2 languages are close and there are a lot of cognates, you can work with that in significant ways as compared to. So teaching a English speaker Spanish or French, you want to show the student how much the student already knows by illustrating how you can deal with cognates and figure them out and pronounce them correctly. Whereas if you're dealing with teaching English to a Chinese speaker, there are many fewer cognates, though I remember somebody telling me quite a few years ago even that there were 10,000 English words used in Japanese.
Wow.
So there's a lot of sharing around, but there are some things about English that make it difficult. Not that there aren't things about other languages that make them difficult too.
Sure.
But there are some things about English that many English speakers aren't aware of. Just in terms of pronunciation, we do have a couple of hard sounds that aren't that common in languages around the world and are a little bit difficult. The American English R is one that many people have trouble with, and the TH sound, think,
Yeah.
is difficult for speakers to pick up. It's often late in their learning career that they learn those well. Also, there are our system of two-word verbs. So these are something like look up,
Right.
walk around, think out, get up, things like that. For a speaker of a Latin language, there are often Latin-type equivalents of those. So find out, you have discover, things like that. And the two-word verbs in English often are confusing in that some of them have lots of different meanings that we don't realize. So if you take the expression make up, so you've got makeup, like cosmetics.
Yeah.
You can make something up.
Right.
And you can make up with somebody. So there are all these different meanings of it that are tricky. And often non-native speaker teachers of English don't control those, and they often just aren't taught because they are pretty confusing until a fairly high level. So if what you want to do is to be understood by non-native speakers, remember we're in a world where there are more non-native speakers than native speakers.
Right.
You might want to limit your use of these two and three word verbs.
I see.
Another feature of English that is also a little bit unusual in the world and very characteristic of it is its stress and timing system. So every English word of more than one syllable has one stressed syllable, one syllable that is more stressed than the others. And that syllable gets a stress, gets a beat in the sentence.
Right.
And if you have a 2, 3, 4 syllable word, figuring out which syllable to stress is not at all easy. As a native speaker, you almost never think about it.
Yeah.
We just do it naturally. But it's a substantially complex system that's quite hard for non-native speakers to come to control. Then there's sentence stress, where we have words, each of which has its main stress syllable, but which, by the way, there's secondary stress and tertiary stress also, so even there are complexities at that level. Then in a sentence, there are words that are entirely unstressed, that we fit in between, and the more of them we have, just the faster we say them, as opposed to giving equal time to them. So here's a little exercise kind of that illustrates that from an old English pronunciation textbook I used to use. So I'm going to tap on the table here to show the regular beats of English. So you start off with a stupid sentence like, dogs eat bones. So there each word has a regular beat.
Right.
The dogs eat the bones. Well, there I've added 2 words, but the timing hasn't changed. I've just slipped those unstressed words in. The dogs will eat the bones. Will eat the bones. Gets in there. The will eat the gets in there in the same amount of time as just bones or eat. So we as we add more unstressed words, we just say them faster. The dogs will have eaten the bones.
Interesting.
Now you understand will have eaten just fine.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of the reason why, even though learners often say this, but why some parts of English appears to be very fast, because it is. We say these unstressed syllables very, very fast to fit them into the regular rhythm of English. So things like prepositions and articles and verb forms often just are fit in between the regular beats.
I see. Well, how would that rhythmic analysis apply to, say, like Spanish or another language that you might speak? I'd be interested to hear the comparison.
Well, in Spanish, you get a fairly fast beat for every syllable. So whereas English is da 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 da, Spanish is da 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 da.
Huh.
So everyone is even, and you could say that it's they're all kind of moderately fast, whereas English has stressed syllables that get spread out, and then a bunch of little ones that get stuck in there. I think you can think of since you're a musician, you're probably
Sure.
thinking of the musical equivalents of this.
Exactly. I'm thinking you could actually notate this. It would be an interesting project.
You could. Yeah.
Wow.
So all those things figure in when you're trying to speak to a non-native speaker. I guess something else is the aspect and article system. It's a classic, of course, people from a lot of languages leaving out articles in English or putting them in the wrong place, and the.
Yeah.
And the fact is that's a very complicated system that hinges on the understanding and shared consciousness of the two speakers, as well as a bunch of cultural stuff. Why do we say the sidewalk?
Right.
If the means we both know exactly which one it is, why do we say the sidewalk?
Yeah.
And you can go to church and go to the church, and they have different meanings, in fact.
Right.
So the article system is substantially complicated.
Yeah.
And what you find happens with some of these issues that are difficult in English, faced with the fact that there's so many non-native speakers of English, is that they are developing their own version of English that kind of runs around some of these difficulties. So, if you're in a conversation with a bunch of Japanese and Chinese speakers, you may not hear that many articles. And the fact is, you can understand each other. We native speakers of English need that article. When somebody says something like, we will bring money tomorrow, does that mean some money we're just mentioning now, or is that the money we were just talking about?
Right.
We have that question, and we expect it to be answered by an article one way or another. But, that gets figured out in other ways. So it's work that a native English listener has to do to answer that question, because we're tuned to always knowing that, an answer to that question. Which is it? Whose is it?
Sure.
That the articles supply. But my point here is that native English speakers need to start thinking and using their language in different ways when they're dealing with non-native speakers. So it's kind of a new world for English speakers. And in fact, I think, as opposed to thinking, well, I speak the right language, so I don't need to do anything, they need to both experience learning a language and adjusting your thinking to a different language.
Yeah.
That helps you deal with non-native speakers who are doing that all the time. If you don't know what that experience is, you're not going to empathize with those people. You're not going to understand their rhythm and the intensity of work that they're doing to communicate with you. So that's a bunch of important issues for native English speakers to think about in this world.
Yeah, well, yeah, especially as nowadays, where we're tuned into cultures all over the world in an instant through the internet. We're communicating in ways we had never before. And I guess it really does require a bit of extra sensitivity about what people are listening to, or how they're understanding what we're saying.
Right. And I would sort of as a summary note here say that I think the experience of learning another language yourself, of adjusting your thinking, of figuring out how to handle the speed of that language, because a foreign language always sounds fast to learners.
Yeah, sure.
And experiencing that and having the experience of letting go of some things we feel we need to know, like is the verb past or present? Well, in Chinese, you have to figure out whether the event was past or present by other cues than the verb. It's not in the verb form. So that gives you a whole perspective on the range of thinking and understanding of the world that occurs in different languages.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of Language is produced by Sam Lupowitz and Dan Gable. Recorded by Sam Lupowitz. Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.